They had left the long windows open to the February evening, and the air arrived with its burden of damp earth and iron water, serving as a corrective to the beeswax, stage dust and plain anxiety that inhabited the Windermere music room. Yellow lamps had been arranged along makeshift footlights, casting their devotional glow upon the small stage where a canvas turret stood with puritanical stiffness, as if resentful of its place on wheels. The turret was meant to suggest the Ivory Tower that had given Lady Beatrice Ashford's charity entertainment both its theme and its excuse, yet it settled into the elegant room with the awkward dignity of a folly within a folly. Lady Beatrice herself had stationed herself in the second row, her silver hair wound like a pale crown, pearls at her throat catching the lamplight. When she wished the stage to understand something, she underlined in the air with her pencil and made a generous, helpless expression with her mouth. The assembled company orbited her presence as bees about a hive that had become a post office, drawn by instinct, organised by necessity. "Shall we begin, Julian?" she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of one accustomed to being heard in back rows. "If we do not start, we shall never finish." Julian Rooke, who had been a professional actor in better years and now guided the wealthy through their charitable endeavours, stepped to the centre of the small stage. He was beautiful in the way of a man whose bones had decided against him only recently, his movements retaining the fluid grace that had once commanded West End audiences. "We shall begin," he said, looking down at the floorboards as if listening for complaint, "by beginning. Miss Vale, if you please. Mr. Ashworth, the lantern, no, the other one, the one that refuses to be ordinary." Miranda Vale emerged from the wings with the little pause that belongs to habit. She possessed that tidy intensity that draws the eye at once and keeps it, which is all the stage ever requires. Her hooped skirt made a small geography about her feet as she lifted her chin, which was good, and then lowered it, which was better. "I suppose," she said, not to Julian but to the room itself, that the tower is, in fact, a prison. "That is its reputation," replied Dr. Marcus Bellingham from the fourth row, where he hunched forward as if prepared to attack falsehoods. His voice carried the measured authority of 30 years spent listening to confessions disguised as symptoms. "But a tower is also a point of view, Miss Vale, medievally speaking, a vantage." "Then she is both prisoner and lookout," Miranda observed, smoothing the silk of her bodice as if discovering a map there. Young Timothy Morivant, who had been granted the role of the romantic lead through his family's recent acquisition of the neighbouring estate, adjusted his spectacles nervously. At 26, he possessed the pale intensity of a minor poet, though his stammering delivery suggested he might be better suited to the chorus. Perhaps, he ventured, the character's essential passion should inform the delivery. "Passion, yes," said Miss Cordelia Fairfax, who had claimed her role with the quiet determination of a woman who had never married but never quite abandoned hope. Her smile managed to be both gracious and slightly predatory. "Though we must remember that passion requires precision, mustn't it?" The question hung in the air with a delicacy that suggested multiple interpretations. Miss Fairfax had been Lady Beatrice's closest friend since their shared London season 40 years past, a relationship that had weathered various storms with the resilience of two women who understood that loyalty could coexist quite comfortably with gentle malice. Nigel Ashworth, Lady Beatrice's nephew, appeared from the French doors with that particular brand of studied nonchalance that suggested he had been listening to every word while appearing to pay attention to none. His casting as the elderly clergyman had surprised those who knew his reputation for preferring roles that required neither virtue nor advanced age. "My profound apologies," he said, producing a folded paper from his coat pocket and glancing at it, before returning it with the air of a man replacing a letter in a library. "I was merely admiring your winter roses, Aunt Beatrice. Quite remarkable, considering the season." There was something in his tone that made Miss Fairfax glance sharply toward the curtained windows, though they revealed nothing of the garden beyond. Mrs. Helena Carstairs, the widow of a colonial administrator who had returned to England with a comfortable income and a talent for devastating observations, watched the small drama with the keen attention of a naturalist studying particularly interesting specimens. "Ready," Julian announced, "and begin." They began. The tower looked down upon them as if reserving an opinion, while outside the park made a faint sound with its trees, a noise like very distant applause. Miranda spoke with that inwardness that makes each syllable behave as if it belonged to a memory, and the room settled into the peculiar concentration that belongs to amateur theatricals when they accidentally discover truth. Yet among these correct proceedings there was the smallest sense, as the tide sends forward a first and secret ripple, that something not accounted for had reached the room and taken a seat. On the carpet near the stage, a droplet of something dark had made a small, precise map. Mrs. Prosser, the housekeeper, noticed it and knitted one pearl where a plane had been intended, her eyes doing something else entirely. No one else appeared to see. The light on the turret found, after all, a way to be unliteral. Eyes adjusted. Voices, finding their arrangement, did what discipline and vanity asked of them, and if there were violences in the air they had not yet chosen their moment to declare themselves. The rehearsal progressed with that particular intensity that belongs to amateur theatricals when they discover, quite by accident, that they are approaching competence. Miranda had found her voice in the tower scene, and Timothy, encouraged by Julian's patient coaching, had begun to deliver his lines with something approaching conviction rather than mere hope. The canvas turret, which had seemed so apologetic in the lamplight, now possessed a dignity that made the music room feel less like Lady Beatrice's drawing room and more like a place where stories might unfold with their own authority. Julian moved among them with the fluid grace that had once commanded West End audiences, his hands shaping the air as he guided Miranda through her soliloquy. "The tower is not your prison," he murmured, his voice carrying that particular warmth that belongs to directors who have learned to love their actors' vulnerabilities. "It is your vantage point. You see what others cannot see because you are removed from their immediate concerns." Lady Beatrice, her pencil poised like a conductor's baton, nodded approvingly from her second-row seat. The winter roses that Nigel had arranged upon the music stand caught the lamplight and seemed to approve as well. Their white faces turned towards the stage with the attention of a particularly well-bred audience. "Shall we take 5 minutes?" Julian suggested, glancing at the small clock that presided over the mantelpiece with Victorian certainty. "I believe we've earned the luxury of reflection." The company dispersed with that careful casualness that follows concentrated effort. Miss Fairfax moved to the piano and touched the keys with the reverence of someone who had once played Chopin for drawing rooms that no longer existed. Mrs. Carstairs produced her silver cigarette case and applied flame to tobacco with movements that suggested she had learned the ceremony in Cairo and had never quite abandoned its precision. Timothy removed his spectacles and polished them with the nervous energy of someone who had discovered he might, after all, possess talent. Dr. Bellingham remained in his fourth-row seat, but his attention had shifted from the stage to the French doors, where the February evening pressed against the glass with patient insistence. Something in his expression suggested the professional alertness that had served him through 30 years of listening to confessions disguised as symptoms. Mrs. Prosser appeared with her customary discretion, bearing a tray that balanced silver teapot, thin sandwiches, and a small dish of sugared almonds with the mathematical precision that belonged to her calling. She moved through the room with that particular invisibility that skilled servants cultivate, noting as she passed that the dark spot on the carpet had been joined by a second, smaller mark near the stage. Julian accepted his cup with the absent courtesy of someone whose attention remained partially engaged with artistic problems. He had settled into the chair that Lady Beatrice had vacated, his script balanced on his knee, his free hand tracing patterns in the air as if choreographing invisible dancers. The tea, when he lifted it to his lips, seemed to please him. He smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had found exactly the temperature he required. "The third act," he said to no one in particular, his voice carrying the dreamy quality that belongs to directors who have begun to see their vision taking shape. "I believe we shall need something more definitive, a gesture that encompasses the entire metaphor." Miranda, still in her hooped costume, approached with her own cup. "What sort of gesture?" she inquired, settling carefully into the chair beside him. The silk of her bodice caught the lamplight and transformed it into something that suggested both innocence and its opposite. Julian's response came slowly, as if he were reading it from some invisible script suspended in the air before him. Something that suggests the moment when one realizes that the tower was never a prison at all, but simply— His voice trailed away, not from uncertainty, but from a kind of peaceful completion, as if he had found the exact word he sought and no longer needed to speak it aloud. The room continued its quiet business around him. Miss Fairfax's piano offered a fragment of Mozart that dissolved into silence. Mrs. Carstairs exhaled smoke that rose toward the ceiling in elegant spirals. Lady Beatrice discussed costume adjustments with Mrs. Prosser in the low tones that suggested domestic conspiracy. It was Miranda who first noticed that Julian's stillness had acquired a quality that transcended artistic contemplation. His teacup remained balanced in his hand, but the hand itself had settled into a position that suggested permanence rather than pause. His eyes, which had been following some invisible choreography, now regarded a fixed point beyond the French doors with the attention of someone who had found what he had been seeking and no longer needed to search. "Julian," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough concern to draw the attention of others without creating alarm. Dr. Bellingham rose from his seat with the automatic response that belonged to his profession. He approached with the measured steps of someone who had learned to recognize the small signs that preceded larger revelations. When he reached Julian's chair, he paused for a moment, his medical training asserting itself over social protocol. "Julian," he said, his voice carrying the gentle authority that he employed for patients who required careful handling. When no response came, he placed his fingers against the pulse point at Julian's wrist with movements that suggested both expertise and reluctance. The silence that followed contained the weight of recognition. Dr. Bellingham's face arranged itself into the expression of professional gravity that he had perfected over decades of delivering news that no one wished to receive. He looked up to meet Lady Beatrice's questioning gaze and made the smallest movement with his head that people always imagine themselves strong enough to bear until they see it directed at them. Lady Beatrice set down her teacup with movements that suggested she was placing it in a museum where it would remain undisturbed forever. "Mrs. Prosser," she said, her voice carrying the controlled calm that her generation employed for all announcements from christenings to catastrophes. "The telephone, if you please." Mrs. Prosser moved toward the door with the efficiency that belonged to someone whose training had prepared her for moments when the ordinary arrangements of life required immediate revision. As she passed Julian's chair, she noticed that his script had fallen to the floor, its pages open to the final scene where the prisoner realizes that escape has always been possible. The winter roses on the music stand seemed to regard the proceedings with the same white-faced attention they had offered the performance, their petals beginning to show the first signs of the browning that would claim them before morning. The canvas turret stood in its place, patient and unchanged, waiting for a director who would never again call for places or guide actors through the delicate business of transforming themselves into other people. In the silence that settled over the music room like dust over abandoned furniture, the only sound was the distant ringing of the telephone as Mrs. Prosser carried out her instructions, and the soft whisper of the February wind against windows that now seemed to separate them from a world that had become, in the space of a heartbeat, entirely different from the one they had inhabited when the evening began. Inspector Roderick Alleyn arrived at Windermere as the February evening deepened into something more consequential than mere weather. The gravel beneath his motorcar's tyres made a sound like distant applause, though the performance it might have been acknowledging had concluded with a finality that no curtain call could remedy. Mrs. Prosser opened the front door before his hand reached the bell, her expression containing that particular blend of professional composure and genuine distress that belongs to housekeepers who have learned to navigate domestic catastrophes with the same efficiency they bring to managing silver. "Inspector Alleyn," she said, her voice carrying the controlled precision of someone who had spent the past hour maintaining order, while chaos threatened the household's carefully established rhythms. "Lady Beatrice is in the morning room. Dr. Bellingham is with her." "Thank you, Mrs. Prosser," Alleyn replied, noting in her manner the sort of steady competence that suggested she had observed more of the evening's events than anyone might yet have thought to ask. "I trust nothing has been disturbed in the music room?" "Nothing, sir. Constable Weatherby has been most particular about that." The corridor retained the warmth of beeswax and well-tended fires, though underneath these familiar domestic scents lay something else, the peculiar atmospheric pressure that death creates in houses where it arrives uninvited. Alleyn's footsteps made a courteous sound upon the parquet as he made his way toward the morning room, where Lady Beatrice sat with Dr. Bellingham in consultation over circumstances that neither their breeding nor their professional experience had quite prepared them to navigate. Lady Beatrice rose as he entered, her silver hair still perfectly arranged despite the evening's disruptions, her pearls catching the lamplight with a sort of understated elegance that suggested she had learned to wear jewellery as other women wore confidence. "Inspector Alleyn," she said, extending her hand with movements that retained their natural grace. "How very good of you to come so promptly, though I confess I had rather hoped we might never require your particular expertise." "Lady Beatrice," Alleyn replied, accepting her hand with the courtesy that his upbringing had made as natural as breathing. "I understand there has been a tragedy during your rehearsal." Dr. Bellingham, who had been standing near the fireplace with the air of a man consulting his own professional conscience, stepped forward with the measured deliberation that belonged to his calling. "Inspector, I examined Mr. Rook immediately, of course. His heart appears simply to have stopped, though at 52, and in apparent good health." He allowed the sentence to dissolve into the sort of silence that medical men employ when certainty eludes them. "Dr. Bellingham," Alleyn acknowledged, "you were present during the rehearsal?" "I was playing a small role, the village priest." Julian was quite pleased with the evening's progress. We had taken an interval for tea, and he was discussing the third act when Bellingham's voice carried the particular frustration of a physician who had witnessed death arrive without the courtesy of announcing its intentions. Alleyn nodded with understanding. "If I may, I should like to see the music room before we proceed further. The scene, as it were, while it still retains its immediate character." Lady Beatrice gestured toward the French doors that connected the morning room to the music room, where the canvas turret stood in patient attendance, over circumstances it had not been constructed to witness. "The company remains in the library," she said. "They felt it would be improper to leave before—" "Quite right," Alleyn murmured, and stepped through the French doors into the scene that death had arranged with such theatrical precision. The music room retained the atmosphere of interrupted performance. Yellow lamps still cast their devotional glow upon the small stage, though the light now seemed to serve a different purpose entirely. Julian Rook sat in his chair with the sort of composed stillness that suggested he had simply paused in conversation and might resume at any moment, were it not for the absolute quality of his repose that made such resumption impossible. Alleyn approached with the measured steps of someone who had learned to read rooms as other men read books. He noted first the teacup balanced with elegant precision in Julian's hand, the saucer resting upon his knee as if placed there by a particularly careful stage manager. The script that had fallen to the floor lay open to a page marked with pencil, its lines speaking with unintended irony to the present circumstances. The air held layers of scent, the familiar blend of tea and beeswax, the ghost of tobacco from Mrs. Carstairs' cigarette, and underneath these domestic aromas, something else. Something that suggested almonds, though no almonds appeared on Mrs. Prosser's carefully arranged tea service. Alleyn bent fractionally over the teacup, not quite touching it, and drew the faintest breath. The sweetness was there, delicate but unmistakable, speaking in the chemical language that he had learned to recognise in other drawing rooms where death had chosen to make social calls. The carpet near the stage bore 2 small stains, dark and precise as punctuation marks. Alleyn knelt beside them with the sort of careful attention that a scholar might bring to examining a manuscript, touching one lightly with his handkerchief and noting the way it had dried to dullness. Not wine, not ink, but something that had once been liquid and was now evidence. Mr. Fox arrived with his characteristic blend of deference and efficiency, taking in the scene with the sort of comprehensive glance that belonged to men who had learned to catalogue tragedy without being overwhelmed by it. They exchanged the brief professional consultation that years of partnership had refined to an art form, Fox's solid presence providing the practical foundation upon which Alleyn's more intuitive observations could build. "The company, sir?" Fox inquired in his quiet way. "In the library," Alleyn replied. "Lady Beatrice has been most considerate in keeping them available, though I suspect each of them would prefer to be anywhere else in England at the moment." He moved to the tea service, noting without appearing to count that 6 cups showed signs of use, each bearing its own small signature of lipstick, or the ridge left by hasty drinking, or the careful placement that belonged to those who had learned to handle china as if it might be required to testify to their character. The dish of sugared almonds rested beside the sandwiches with innocent self-possession, though Alleyn found himself regarding them with the sort of attention that their modest appearance hardly seemed to warrant. The winter roses that Nigel Ashworth had arranged upon the music stand had begun to show the first signs of the browning that would claim them before morning, their white faces turned toward the stage with the attention of an audience that would never applaud again. The stems had been cut at an angle, and a faint dampness remained on the music stand beneath the vase. Not water, but something greener, more organic. Alleyn returned to the French doors and looked back at the scene with the sort of comprehensive gaze that painters employ when stepping back from their easels. The canvas turret stood in its place with patient dignity. The yellow lamps cast their pools of attention upon faces that were no longer acting, and in the chair that had become the evening's most significant piece of furniture, Julian Rook waited with the sort of theatrical stillness that no director could have achieved through mere instruction. "I believe," Alleyn said to Fox in his quiet way, "we shall find this evening's performance rather more complex than its programme suggested. Shall we speak with the company? I suspect each of them has a different version of the same story to tell." The library, when they reached it, contained the sort of subdued gathering that follows the interruption of ordinary life by extraordinary circumstances. Miranda Vale sat with her hooped skirt arranged around her like a silk fortress, her face pale but composed. Miss Fairfax maintained her position near the window, with the sort of alert attention that suggested she was prepared to observe whatever might unfold next. Mrs. Carstairs had found a chair that allowed her to see everyone while appearing to notice no one, her cigarette holder held at precisely the angle that suggested both sophistication and readiness. Nigel Ashworth stood with his back to the fire, his usual air of languid detachment now overlaid with something that might have been genuine concern. Timothy Morrivan polished his spectacles with the nervous energy of someone who hoped that cleaner lenses might help him see his way through circumstances that had become entirely too real for comfort. Alleyn entered the library with the sort of unobtrusive presence that belonged to men who had learned to observe human nature in its moments of greatest vulnerability. He possessed the gift of making people feel that their cooperation was not merely requested, but genuinely appreciated, a quality that had served him well in drawing rooms where the truth often wore evening dress and spoke in the language of implication rather than declaration. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the sort of quiet authority that made formal introductions unnecessary, "I hope you will forgive the intrusion. I shall need to speak with each of you briefly, though I suspect the evening has already asked more of you than any rehearsal should require." The room settled into the sort of attentive silence that belongs to audiences waiting for the next act to begin, though none of them yet understood that they had become both performers and observers in a drama that Julian Rook would never direct to its conclusion. Alleyn began his interviews with the sort of methodical discretion that belonged to men who had learned to extract truth from drawing rooms where secrets wore evening dress. He established himself in Lady Beatrice's morning room, where family portraits regarded the proceedings with painted neutrality, and requested that each member of the company join him privately. The arrangement possessed the courtesy of a social call, while maintaining the gravity of official inquiry. Lady Beatrice entered first, settling into her chair with the composed grace that her generation had perfected for navigating domestic catastrophes. Her pearls caught the lamplight as she arranged her hands in her lap with mathematical precision. "Lady Beatrice," Alleyn began, his voice carrying the sort of quiet authority that invited confidence rather than demanding it. "I understand this has been a most distressing evening. If you could help me establish the sequence of events as clearly as possible." "Of course, Inspector," as she replied, her voice maintaining its natural authority despite the circumstances. Julian was in exceptional spirits this evening. We had been working together for 3 weeks, and he seemed genuinely pleased with our progress. During the interval, Mrs. Prosser served tea in her customary fashion. She's quite meticulous about such arrangements. Julian accepted his cup with obvious pleasure and settled into animated discussion about the third act. "You noticed nothing unusual in his manner? No suggestion of discomfort?" "Quite the contrary. Julian possessed that particular vitality that belongs to directors when they see their vision taking shape. If anything, he appeared more energetic than usual." Lady Beatrice paused, her gaze moving briefly toward the music room. "Inspector, Julian had become rather dear to us during these rehearsals. His death represents not merely the loss of our director, but the end of something we had all begun to treasure." Miranda Vale entered with the sort of composed intensity that suggested she understood herself to be playing a role for which no script had been provided. She had changed from her costume into a simple wool dress, though her eyes retained the luminous quality that had served her well upon the stage. "Miss Vale," Alleyn said gently, "you were seated nearest to Mr. Rook when he collapsed. Could you describe his demeanour in those final moments? He was radiant, Inspector. Julian had just articulated something beautiful about the tower scene, that it represented not imprisonment, but perspective. He was holding his teacup, speaking with such enthusiasm about the metaphor, when his voice simply faded. Her hand moved unconsciously to her throat. I thought at first he was demonstrating some acting technique. Julian was always showing us how to use silence, how to let meaning emerge from stillness. The tea service, Miss Vale. Did you assist in any way? I carried Julian's cup to him. Mrs. Prosser had arranged everything on the tray, but Julian was speaking, and one doesn't wish to interrupt a director in the midst of inspiration. She paused, a small crease appearing between her brows. He always took lemon in his tea. He said sugar muffled the note, an actor's way of speaking about such things. You are quite observant. We all observed Julian closely. He taught us to notice details, to find meaning in small gestures. Her voice carried a note of loss that transcended theatrical training. Dr. Bellingham approached the interview with professional composure, though Alleyn detected something beneath his medical authority that suggested personal distress carefully controlled. Doctor, your initial assessment was cardiac failure. Are you confident in that conclusion? It remains the most probable explanation for a man of 52 with no apparent history of heart disease. Bellingham replied with measured precision. However, I confess to a certain unease. Julian's collapse struck me as unusually peaceful. In my experience, cardiac failure typically involves considerable distress, yet he simply ceased, as if he had found exactly what he was seeking and no longer required consciousness to possess it. You detected no other symptoms? Nothing that might suggest alternative causes? Bellingham's pause suggested consultation with both professional knowledge and personal observation. There was a faint sweetness in the air during the interval. I attributed it to the sugared almonds, though Julian seemed particularly fond of them this evening. Miss Fairfax received Alleyn with the sort of gracious attention that suggested she had been preparing for this conversation since Mrs. Prosser's telephone call. Her position near the window allowed her to observe both the inspector and the music room beyond. Miss Fairfax, you have known Mr. Rook for some time, I believe. Since his earliest days on the stage, Inspector, a truly gifted performer, though perhaps too sensitive for the profession's harsher realities. Her voice carried the measured warmth of someone discussing a valued but complicated friendship. Julian had a charm that was universally acknowledged, but charm, Inspector, can sometimes breed expectations, or disappointments. You suggest there were tensions within the company? Life in the theatre, even amateur theatre, is rarely without its undercurrents. Julian inspired devotion, but devotion can be complicated. She smoothed her gloves with movements that suggested diplomatic navigation of delicate territory. This evening, however, proceeded with remarkable harmony until the tragedy occurred. Mrs. Carstairs offered her observations with the detached precision of someone who had spent colonial years learning to assess social situations with scientific objectivity. Her cigarette holder remained poised at exactly the angle that conveyed sophisticated readiness. Julian was perfectly charming this evening, so she said, her slight accent lending authority to her words. I have attended sufficient amateur theatricals to recognise when a director genuinely enjoys his company's possibilities, rather than merely tolerating their limitations. Julian belonged firmly in the former category. You observed nothing concerning? The evening proceeded with comfortable harmony, Inspector, though I found myself wondering about the sugared almonds. Julian seemed particularly drawn to them, selecting them with a sort of deliberate pleasure that suggested they held special significance. She drew thoughtfully upon her cigarette. There was also a faint sweetness in the air that seemed excessive for the quantity of confectionery present. Nigel Ashworth entered with the studied nonchalance that suggested he had been rehearsing his responses. He remained standing, his posture suggesting both courtesy and subtle resistance to authority. Mr. Ashworth, I understand you were absent from the music room during part of the interval. I stepped into the garden to cut winter roses for my aunt. She abhors bare rooms, and the south wall near the old orangery had produced some rather fine specimens. His tone carried the casual confidence of someone accustomed to having his explanations accepted without question. The air was bracing after the theatrical intensity indoors. "You saw nothing unusual? No one approaching the music room from the garden?" "Nothing beyond roses and bare branches, Inspector. The world outside was considerably less dramatic than the one within." His smile possessed the sort of practiced charm that suggested frequent deployment in difficult circumstances. Timothy Morivant approached the interview with the nervous energy of someone who hoped that cooperation might compensate for his obvious distress. His hands trembled slightly as he polished spectacles that required no attention. "Mr. Morivant, you were observing the company during the interval. Did you notice anything unusual?" "I'm afraid I was rather preoccupied with my own performance, Inspector. Julian had been so encouraging about my progress, and I was reviewing my lines for the third act." His voice carried genuine grief beneath the stammering uncertainty. "Though I did notice Miss Fairfax moving the rose vase slightly. It had left watermarks on the music stand, and Dr. Bellingham seemed particularly interested in the French doors, as if he were listening for something." "You have an excellent eye for detail, Mr. Morivant. Such observations are most helpful." Mrs. Prosser appeared last, entering with the unobtrusive certainty of someone who understood when her presence was required. She stood with the sort of alert attention that belonged to those whose professional competence had never been questioned. "Mrs. Prosser, you arranged the tea service this evening?" "Yes, sir, as always. The silver service, thin sandwiches, and the sugared almonds that Mr. Rook had particularly requested for this evening's rehearsal." "Mr. Rook made specific requests?" "He mentioned his fondness for them during his first visit, sir. Said they reminded him of his mother's drawing room." Her expression remained carefully neutral. I placed his cup upon the tray nearest Miss Vale, as she typically assisted with serving. "And the tea itself? Mr. Rook's preferences?" Mrs. Prosser's pause was so brief as to be almost imperceptible, yet Alleyn caught the slight hesitation. "Mr. Rook always requested lemon, sir, though there are some, begging your pardon, who like to say lemon and then take none. It simplifies matters in the kitchen, I imagine." "It does, sir, in kitchens and elsewhere." Her gaze met his with the sort of steady attention that suggested she possessed information she did not yet feel authorized to share. Alleyn thanked her with particular courtesy, and allowed her to retreat into the house's quiet machinery. When the interviews concluded, Fox approached with his characteristic blend of deference and professional assessment. "They're all very polite, sir," he observed mildly. "Indeed," Alleyn replied, moving to the window where the February evening pressed against the glass with patient insistence. "And all quite certain about Mr. Rook's excellent spirits, his particular fondness for sugared almonds, and his preference for lemon in his tea. Such unanimity is either remarkably convenient or remarkably suspicious." He turned from the window, his expression carrying the sort of thoughtful concentration that belonged to men who had learned to recognize the patterns that emerged when people told careful versions of the truth. "Tomorrow morning, Fox, we shall have another conversation with Mrs. Prosser. I suspect the kitchen knows considerably more about this evening's arrangements than the drawing-room has yet chosen to reveal." The canvas turret stood in its place beyond the French doors, patient and unchanged, waiting for a director who would never again call for places or guide actors through the delicate business of transformation. In the silence that had settled over Windermere like dust over abandoned furniture, the only certainty was that the evening's performance had concluded with a finality that no amount of good breeding could quite accommodate, and that the truth, when it emerged, would require considerably more than amateur theatricals to resolve. The following morning arrived at Windermere with the sort of crystalline, February clarity that made secrets more difficult to maintain, though the house itself had resumed its customary rhythms with the determined grace that belongs to establishments where tragedy must not be allowed to disrupt the essential machinery of civilized life. Mrs. Prosser had restored order to all quarters save the music room, where the canvas turret stood in patient attendance over circumstances that no amount of domestic efficiency could remedy. Alleyn found her in the kitchen, that realm of gleaming copper and scrubbed pine where truth could be spoken more plainly than in rooms designed for social performance. She received him with tea served in sturdy china that possessed more dignity than drawing-room silver, her movements carrying the efficient precision of someone who understood that kitchens were places where the real business of houses was conducted. "Mrs. Prosser," Alleyn began, accepting his cup with appreciation for both its contents and the directness it represented. "I suspect you observed considerably more of yesterday evening's arrangements than you felt comfortable discussing in Lady Beatrice's presence." Her pause suggested consultation with loyalties that had served her well through 30 years of managing the delicate balance between discretion and duty. "One learns when to speak and when to listen, Inspector, though last evening presented circumstances that my training hadn't quite anticipated. The tea service, Mrs. Prosser, if you would walk me through the precise arrangements, every detail, however small." "Certainly, sir. The silver service was laid in the pantry as always. Teapot, cream and sugar, lemon slices, thin sandwiches, and the sugared almonds that Mr. Rook had particularly requested." Her voice carried the measured cadence of someone reciting familiar liturgy. 6 cups arranged clockwise, with Mr. Rook's positioned nearest the handle, as Miss Vale typically assisted with the serving. "And the almonds, Mrs. Prosser. You speak of them as if they held particular significance." Mr. Rook had mentioned his fondness during his first visit, said they reminded him of his mother's drawing room, but yesterday afternoon Miss Fairfax arrived with a special selection. Her expression maintained careful neutrality while conveying subtle information. "She said she'd taken the liberty of purchasing them from Harrington's in town, knowing of Mr. Rook's preference, asked me to arrange them properly on the good dish." Fox made a note with quiet efficiency, recognising the significance of this domestic detail. "Miss Fairfax brought them herself?" "Yes, sir. Said presentation mattered for theatrical people, though I did notice they carried a stronger scent than usual. Almonds do have their fragrance, but these seemed more pronounced." Mrs. Prosser's voice carried the sort of professional observation that belonged to those whose duties required attention to such subtleties. The kitchen door opened with the discreet efficiency that announced the arrival of Mr. Chard, the butler, who entered with the polished gravity of his office. His presence carried the sort of understated authority that belonged to men who had spent decades orchestrating the invisible machinery that allowed great houses to function with apparent effortlessness. "Inspector Alleyn," he said, his voice carrying the measured courtesy that his position demanded. "Mrs. Prosser mentioned you might wish to speak with me regarding last evening's service." "Indeed, Mr. Chard. You carried the tea tray into the music room?" "Yes, sir. I placed it upon the small table to Mr. Rook's left, as is customary. Miss Vale assumed her usual role in pouring, though I observed she took particular care in selecting Mr. Rook's cup." His hands maintained the gentle shape of service even in their emptiness. There was considerable movement during the interval. Mr. Ashworth crossed behind me with his roses, Miss Fairfax adjusted the music stand, and the young gentleman approached the window. "You are most observant, Mr. Chard." "It is my profession to notice such things, sir, though I confess yesterday evening's arrangements contained certain irregularities." Alleyn's attention sharpened with the sort of focused interest that belonged to men who had learned to recognise significance in domestic disruptions. "Irregularities? Small matters, Inspector, but in a well-ordered household, small matters often speak to larger disturbances. Mr. Ashworth's roses were arranged before the cloth was properly positioned. The tray was placed left when custom dictates right, and I observed Miss Fairfax making minute adjustments to the lemon dish. She has particular feelings about symmetry." Mrs. Prosser nodded with the sort of professional recognition that passed between servants who understood the significance of disrupted routines. "The house runs on habit, Inspector. When habits are disturbed, it suggests purposes beyond the ordinary." A tentative movement at the kitchen door announced the arrival of Elsie, the under-housemaid, whose reddened hands and careful eyes suggested someone who observed everything while appearing to notice nothing. Mrs. Prosser's glance granted permission for her approach. Elsie assisted in the music room during the interval. Mrs. Prosser explained with a sort of measured introduction that established both authority and protection. "Yes, sir," Elsie said, her voice carrying the careful precision that belonged to those whose observations might be dismissed unless delivered with particular clarity. "I moved the footstool for Miss Vale and attended to watermarks under the rose vase, but I also observed the gentlemen and ladies near the tea tray." "What did you observe, Elsie?" "Mr. Ashworth tidied the cups, sir. Said it would be safer in case of elbows. His hand was wrapped in a handkerchief from a thorn prick, and Miss Fairfax touched the lemon dish. Just a small adjustment. She has particular ways about arrangements." Elsie's account carried the sort of detailed accuracy that belonged to those whose survival depended upon noticing what their betters preferred to ignore. "Anyone else near the service?" "Miss Vale poured for Mr. Rook with special care, sir, and Mrs. Carstairs held her cigarette well away from the tray, very considerate about the smoke. The doctor watched Mr. Rook kindly, and the young gentleman seemed nervous about his lines." When Elsie had been dismissed with appropriate thanks, Mrs. Prosser remained standing with the sort of alert attention that suggested she possessed additional information requiring careful consideration. "Inspector," she said finally, "there is something else. Mr. Rook visited the kitchen earlier in the evening before the rehearsal proper, said he wanted a few almonds to steady his nerves before the performance. I provided them from my usual store. He seemed nervous." "Not nervous, sir, excited. He spoke of the evening's importance, of how well the company was progressing, said he had particular hopes for the third act." Her expression suggested she had found his enthusiasm both touching and slightly excessive. Though he did mention that amateur theatricals could be unpredictable, that one never knew what surprises the evening might contain. Alleyn thanked Mrs. Prosser and Mr. Chard with particular courtesy, recognising that their observations had provided the sort of detailed foundation upon which larger deductions could be built. The kitchen had revealed its secrets with the sort of methodical precision that belonged to places where truth was measured in teaspoons and served with appropriate ceremony. As he prepared to leave, Fox approached with his characteristic blend of deference and professional assessment. "They know considerably more than they've said, sir." "Indeed," Alleyn replied, moving toward the corridor where the house's restored order waited with patient dignity. "But they also understand that knowledge must be shared carefully, particularly when it concerns the households that employ them. Mrs. Prosser's observations about disrupted routines may prove more valuable than any amount of dramatic testimony." The morning light continued its patient illumination of Wintermere's secrets, revealing that the previous evening's performance had contained subtleties that no script could have accommodated. In the careful observations of those whose profession required them to notice everything while appearing to see nothing, Alleyn had found the beginning of a pattern that would, in time, reveal the elegant complexity of Julian Rook's final curtain call. The canvas turret stood in its place beyond the kitchen windows, patient and unchanged, waiting for revelations that would transform it from mere theatrical property into something approaching monument, a silent witness to the sort of performance that required no audience save justice itself. The music room received Alleyn's return with the sort of patient dignity that belongs to spaces where tragedy has arranged itself among familiar objects with theatrical precision. The February light had found accommodation with the yellow lamps, and the canvas turret maintained its vigil with the steadfast attention of a witness whose testimony would never be required in court. Mrs. Prosser accompanied him with the quiet efficiency that belonged to housekeepers, who understood that truth often resided in domestic details too small for drawing-room conversation. "If you would be so kind, Mrs. Prosser," Alleyn said, his voice carrying the sort of courteous authority that invited cooperation rather than demanding it. "I should like to examine the tea service exactly as it was arranged yesterday evening, every detail, however seemingly insignificant." Mrs. Prosser produced the tea tray from the pantry, with movements that suggested she had been preserving it as carefully as evidence in a museum. The silver service retained its mathematical precision, 6 cups arranged with the sort of domestic geometry that belonged to houses where ritual possessed the force of law. Yet even in their careful preservation, the cups bore witness to the evening's interrupted performance, the faint residue of lipstick, the careful placement that belonged to those who handled china as testimony to their character, the ridge left by hasty drinking. The sugared almonds, Mrs. Prosser, Miss Fairfax's special contribution from Harrington's. "Yes, sir. She arrived yesterday afternoon with a paper bag, most particular about the presentation. Said Mr. Rook would appreciate the abundance." Mrs. Prosser's voice carried the measured precision of someone reciting familiar liturgy, though her expression suggested she possessed additional information requiring careful consideration. Alleyn approached the small dish with a sort of focused attention that made morning light seem suddenly significant. The almonds appeared unremarkable at first glance, white-coated confections that might grace any drawing-room tea service. Yet closer examination revealed subtle variations that spoke to more complex arrangements. Some bore the smooth perfection of commercial manufacture, while others showed slight irregularities that suggested individual attention. 2 varieties, I believe you mentioned? Miss Fairfax was most specific, sir. Jordan almonds for presentation, and a smaller quantity of what she called bitter almonds for their superior fragrance. Said theatrical people appreciated such refinements. Mrs. Prosser's pause suggested consultation with loyalties that had served her well through decades of managing delicate domestic situations. I mixed them as she requested, though I confess the bitter ones carried a more pronounced scent than I had anticipated. Fox appeared at Alleyn's shoulder with his characteristic blend of deference and professional readiness, producing a small card from his notebook. Harrington sent there. Confirmation, sir. Miss Fairfax's order yesterday afternoon. Jordan almonds and a small box of bitter almonds specifically requested for theatrical enhancement, according to their records. The significance of this revelation settled over the room with the sort of quiet authority that belongs to facts too important to announce themselves dramatically. Alleyn examined the almond dish with renewed attention, noting the subtle clustering that suggested deliberate arrangement rather than random distribution. The bitter almonds, when identified, possessed a slightly different texture and a more pronounced fragrance that explained Mrs. Prosser's professional unease. And the tea service placement, Mrs. Prosser. Mr. Chard mentioned certain irregularities in the evening's arrangements. The tray was positioned on the left rather than the right, sir, to accommodate Mr. Ashworth's roses. It disrupted the natural flow of service. Miss Vale had to reach across herself for the lemon, and the cup intended for Mr. Rook ended in an unusual position. Her voice carried the sort of professional frustration that belonged to those whose competence depended upon maintaining established routines. Alleyn turned his attention to the winter roses that had provided the evening's floral decoration. The arrangement stood with patient dignity upon the music stand. Though the flowers themselves had progressed further in their decline, their white faces now showing brown edges that would claim them entirely before evening. The water in which they stood had acquired a faint green tinge that suggested more than mere floral decay. "Mr. Ashworth's garden expedition," Alleyn murmured, approaching the arrangement with systematic attention. Elsie mentioned his handkerchief-wrapped hand and the adjustment of the vase's position. The stems, cut at precise angles, remained firm in their crystal vase, though the water told a more complex story. Its green tinge and slight oily quality suggested the presence of something beyond ordinary chlorophyll. When Alleyn touched his handkerchief to the liquid and examined it closely, his expression registered the sort of professional interest that belonged to men who had learned to find significance in botanical evidence. Hellebore, Mrs. Prosser, what the gardener calls winter roses, though they bear little resemblance to their summer cousins. Mr. Peck did mention that Mr. Ashworth had been stung by the sap, sir. Said it would make his hands smart and go a bit numb, warned him about marking the carpets. The revelation provided elegant resolution to several of the evening's minor mysteries. The green stains on the music stand, the dampness that had seemed more organic than water, the dark spots on the carpet, all could be attributed to hellebore sap carried in on stems and hands that had encountered the plant's defensive chemistry. Yet even as this botanical evidence explained the evening's peripheral mysteries, it served to highlight the more significant questions that remained unanswered. Alleyn returned to the tea service with the sort of methodical attention that belonged to men who understood that domestic rituals possessed their own forensic significance. The placement of cups, the positioning of the tray, the careful arrangement of lemon slices, each element spoke to the sort of established routine that made deviation both noticeable and significant. "Julian's preference for lemon, Mrs. Prosser. You mentioned that some people request it without actually taking it." "Mr. Rook was most particular about his tea, sir. Always lemon, never sugar. Said it clarified the taste." Her pause suggested she was consulting memories that had acquired new significance. "Though last evening, when Miss Vale served him, I noticed he seemed to hesitate before adding it, unusual for someone so definite in his habits. The observation possessed the sort of quiet authority that belonged to those whose professional competence depended upon noticing when familiar routines encountered unexpected variations. In houses like Windermere, where social ritual possessed the force of natural law, such deviations carried meaning that transcended their apparent insignificance. Fox approached with additional evidence gathered from his systematic examination of the room's physical testimony. "The carpet stains, sir. Analysis suggests they're not wine or ink, but something with a metallic quality, and there's a similar residue on the table edge where the tea service was positioned." Alleyn knelt beside the dark marks with movements that suggested both scientific attention and artistic appreciation for their precise placement. The stains possessed a quality that spoke of liquid spilled with purpose rather than accident, too deliberate in their positioning to represent mere clumsiness, too significant in their composition to dismiss as domestic mishap. "The method begins to declare itself, Fox," Alleyn said quietly, rising with movements that retained their natural grace despite the morning's intensive examination. Someone who understood Julian's habits, who possessed access to both the tea service and specialised knowledge of botanical and chemical properties, someone who could arrange for the evening's routine to be disrupted just enough to create opportunity while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. The canvas turret stood in patient attendance over these revelations, its theatrical dignity unchanged by the morning's discoveries. In the careful arrangement of evidence, bitter almonds and hellebore sap, disrupted rituals and broken habits, Alleyn was beginning to discern the elegant choreography that had led to Julian Rook's final performance. The truth was emerging not through dramatic revelation, but through the sort of methodical attention to domestic detail that characterised the best detective work. In drawing rooms where secrets wore evening dress and spoke in the language of implication, the most significant clues often resided in the angle of a teacup or the placement of a flower arrangement. "We shall need to speak with Miss Fairfax again, Fox," Alleyn said, moving toward the French doors where morning light continued its patient illumination of Windermere's carefully maintained surfaces. Her contributions to yesterday evening's arrangements appear to have been more significant than her initial testimony suggested, and I suspect we shall find that her knowledge of theatrical enhancement extends considerably beyond mere aesthetic appreciation. The morning had revealed its secrets with the sort of methodical precision that belonged to houses where truth could be measured in teaspoons and served with appropriate ceremony. Yet even as the physical evidence declared its testimony, Alleyn understood that the human element of the mystery, the careful psychology that had transformed domestic routine into elegant murder, remained to be fully explored. The winter roses continued their patient decline in their crystal vase, their botanical testimony now understood and catalogued. The bitter almonds rested in their dish with the sort of innocent self-possession that belonged to evidence waiting for its significance to be properly appreciated. And in the silence that had settled over the music room like dust over abandoned furniture, the only certainty was that Julian Rook's final curtain call had been orchestrated with the sort of meticulous attention to detail that would have earned his professional admiration had he lived to appreciate its elegant execution. The afternoon light at Windermere possessed that particular February quality that made secrets more difficult to maintain, though the house itself continued its patient accommodation of circumstances that no amount of domestic efficiency could entirely resolve. The canvas turret stood in its accustomed place, maintaining its theatrical vigil with the sort of dignified persistence that belonged to stage properties awaiting a director who would never again call for places. Alleyn had requested Miss Fairfax's presence for a second interview, though Mr. Chard returned with the sort of diplomatic regret that suggested the lady in question had discovered pressing obligations elsewhere in the house. Her indisposition, delivered with appropriate concern for her delicate constitution, possessed the convenient timing that belonged to those who preferred to choose their moments for difficult conversations. "Miss Fairfax begs to be excused, sir," Chard reported with the measured courtesy that his position demanded. "A severe headache has necessitated her withdrawal to her rooms. Mrs. Prosser has provided a tray." "Of course," Alleyn replied, noting that refusal, properly timed, sometimes revealed more than immediate compliance. "Please convey my hopes for her swift recovery. Perhaps she will feel equal to a brief conversation when her health permits." The domestic machinery of Windermere continued its quiet operation around these polite evasions, though Alleyn detected in the house's atmosphere that subtle alteration which occurs when ordinary arrangements encounter extraordinary circumstances. Lady Beatrice maintained her position as hostess with the sort of composed authority that her generation had perfected for navigating social catastrophes, while the remaining members of the theatrical company applied themselves to the business of appearing normally occupied despite their obvious desire to be anywhere else in England. Fox approached with his characteristic blend of deference and professional efficiency, bearing a slip of paper that possessed the sort of official precision which transformed casual inquiry into legal significance. "From Prentice and Gale, sir, the chemist in Harting. They've confirmed a purchase made 2 days ago." Alleyn examined the duplicate receipt with the sort of focused attention that made morning light seem suddenly meaningful. The neat handwriting and careful signature arranged themselves among the investigation's accumulating facts with mathematical precision. One small bottle of oil of bitter almonds, purchased by Mr. Nigel Ashworth, ostensibly for scenting drawers. Mr. Ashworth's domestic arrangements appear to require considerable aromatic enhancement, Alleyn observed mildly. Did the chemist remark upon his manner? "Perfectly agreeable, sir. Also purchased essence of lemon and something called flowers of heliotrope. Said they were for a lady's room." Fox's expression suggested he was cataloguing these purchases with the sort of professional interest that belonged to men who understood that domestic refinements could serve purposes beyond mere aesthetic improvement. The significance of these revelations settled over the morning room with quiet authority. Nigel Ashworth's chemical purchases, combined with Miss Fairfax's specialised knowledge of confectionery enhancement, suggested a level of preparation that transcended casual theatrical enthusiasm. Yet even as the evidence accumulated its elegant testimony, Alleyn recognised that the human psychology underlying these arrangements remained to be fully explored. Miranda Vale appeared at the morning-room threshold with the sort of hesitant grace that belonged to those who possessed information requiring careful delivery. She carried her script with the reverence of someone handling evidence, though her expression suggested she was uncertain whether her discovery warranted official attention. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I found something in my pages this morning. I'm not certain what to make of it." She offered him a folded slip of paper bearing an elegant spare hand that suggested both education and restraint. The message possessed theatrical simplicity. "Meet me by the turret after the interval, J." "You did not show this yesterday, Miss Vale." "I only discovered it when I opened my script after breakfast. It must have been placed there during the rehearsal, or in the confusion that followed." Her fingers betrayed the smallest tremor as she spoke. "Julian was not a man for clandestine arrangements, Inspector. If he wished to speak with me privately, he would have done so with perfect courtesy, in full view of the company. This seems theatrical, like a piece of stage business." Alleyn examined the paper with systematic attention, noting its ordinary quality and the faint sweetness that clung to it, a scent that suggested almonds rather than the lemon cologne that Julian typically favoured. The note possessed the sort of calculated authenticity that belonged to forgeries created by someone who understood both Julian's character and the effect such a message might produce. "You did not go to the turret, Miss Vale?" "No, Inspector. The interval was entirely occupied with tea and conversation. I scarcely left my chair." Her voice carried the sort of honest bewilderment that belonged to those who found themselves inadvertently involved in circumstances beyond their understanding. When Miranda had departed with appropriate thanks for her cooperation, Fox settled into consultation with his notebook, his expression suggesting the sort of methodical assessment that preceded significant observations. "The purchases, sir, and now this note. Someone has been rather busy with preparations." Indeed, Fox, though whether the preparations were Julian's own or someone else's theatrical contribution remains to be determined. Alleyn moved to the window where afternoon light continued its patient revelation of Wintermere's carefully maintained surfaces. The note suggests Julian requested a private meeting that never occurred, yet Julian himself is no longer available to confirm or deny such intentions. The investigation was acquiring the sort of elegant complexity that characterized cases where domestic routine had been transformed into something approaching art. Each piece of evidence, the chemical purchases, the forged correspondence, the specialized confectionery, contributed to a pattern that spoke of careful orchestration rather than spontaneous passion. Mrs. Prosser appeared with her customary discretion, though her expression suggested she possessed information that transcended routine domestic reporting. "Inspector, if you please, I've discovered something in the green room that may be of interest." She led them to the small chamber adjacent to the music room, where theatrical properties awaited their next performance with patient dignity. Among the accumulated detritus of amateur dramatics, fans, wraps, and the small vanities that belong to those who transform themselves into other people, lay a blue glass vial fitted with a silver cap. Its label bore the familiar precision of provincial, chemists, essence of bitter almonds, Prentice and Gale, Harting. "Where exactly was this found, Mrs. Prosser?" "In the property basket, sir. Not hidden precisely, but placed where it might be discovered by chance or overlooked entirely." Her voice carried the sort of professional observation that belonged to those whose duties required attention to such details. The cap shows traces of recent use, and there's a slight residue on the glass. Alleyn examined the vial without touching it, noting the careful placement that suggested someone had wished it to be found eventually, though not immediately. The bottle's position among the theatrical properties possessed a symbolic quality that spoke to someone with an appreciation for dramatic irony. "Thank you, Mrs. Prosser. Your attention to such matters is invaluable." When she'd withdrawn with appropriate courtesy, Fox approached the vial with his characteristic blend of professional interest and practical caution. "Convenient location, sir, almost as if it were meant to be discovered." "Precisely, Fox. Someone wishes us to understand that yesterday evening's performance contained elements not included in the original script." Alleyn regarded the green room's modest collection of theatrical properties with renewed attention. "The question remains whether we are discovering evidence or following a trail that someone has been careful to establish." The afternoon progressed with the sort of methodical precision that belonged to investigations where truth emerged through accumulated detail rather than dramatic revelation. Yet even as the physical evidence declared its testimony, Alleyn understood that the human psychology underlying these arrangements, the careful motivations that had transformed charitable entertainment into something approaching tragedy, remained to be fully explored. Lady Beatrice appeared in the doorway with the sort of composed authority that suggested she had been observing the investigation's progress with the attention of someone whose household had become, however temporarily, the scene of circumstances requiring resolution. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying the measured courtesy that her position demanded, "Nigel has telephoned from Harting. He expects to return before tea, though he mentioned that his business with the solicitor may require additional consultation." "Most considerate of him to keep us informed, Lady Beatrice." "Nigel can be impulsive, Inspector, though he is rarely irresponsible. I trust his absence has not inconvenienced your inquiries." The observation possessed the sort of diplomatic precision that suggested Lady Beatrice understood her nephew's character contained complexities that required careful management. Her loyalty remained unshakable, yet her intelligence recognised that circumstances had moved beyond the reach of mere social accommodation. As the afternoon light continued its patient revelation of Wintermere's secrets, Alleyn found himself regarding the accumulated evidence with the sort of thoughtful attention that belonged to men who understood that elegant crimes required elegant solutions. The chemical purchases, the forged correspondence, the carefully placed evidence. Each element contributed to a pattern that spoke of sophisticated planning rather than spontaneous passion. Yet even as the investigation's machinery gathered its methodical testimony, the human element of the mystery, the careful psychology that had transformed Julian Rook's final performance into something approaching art, remained to be fully understood. In drawing rooms where secrets wore evening dress and spoke in the language of implication, the most significant revelations often emerged not through dramatic confrontation, but through the sort of patient observation that recognised when politeness had been required to accommodate murder. The canvas turret stood in patient attendance over these developments, its theatrical dignity unchanged by the afternoon's discoveries. In the quiet accumulation of evidence and the subtle fracturing of social composure, Alleyn was beginning to discern the elegant choreography that had led to Julian Rook's final curtain call, though whether that performance had been his own creation or someone else's theatrical contribution, remained to be determined through the sort of careful investigation that transformed domestic detail into legal certainty. The evening at Windermere settled with that peculiar quality which belongs to houses where ordinary arrangements have been required to accommodate extraordinary circumstances. The February twilight pressed against the long windows with patient insistence, transforming the morning room into a study in chiaroscuro, where family portraits regarded the day's revelations with painted neutrality. Alleyn had positioned himself near the window, where afternoon light continued its methodical revelation of secrets that no amount of domestic efficiency could entirely conceal. The accumulated evidence arranged itself in his mind with the sort of mathematical precision that belonged to men who had learned to find patterns in human behaviour as others found melodies in scattered notes. Fox had departed for the village with specific inquiries regarding the chemical purchases, leaving Alleyn to the more delicate task of understanding the psychology that had transformed charitable entertainment into elegant homicide. He considered the company as one might examine pieces on a chessboard, each possessing its own movement and capability. Miss Fairfax, whose convenient indisposition had prevented further direct questioning, emerged as a figure of particular interest. Her precise instructions regarding the almonds, her knowledge of theatrical enhancement, and her subtle adjustments to the tea service spoke to a meticulous nature capable of careful orchestration. Her long friendship with Lady Beatrice provided both access and a certain immunity from immediate suspicion, yet friendship, as Alleyn knew, could accommodate complications that mere acquaintance never reached. Nigel Ashworth's chemical purchases possessed the sort of calculated transparency that suggested either complete innocence or sophisticated misdirection. His explanation of scenting drawers carried the casual confidence of someone accustomed to having his accounts accepted without question, yet the coincidence of bitter almond essence and hellebore sap created a combination that transcended mere domestic refinement. His absence in Harting, ostensibly for legal consultation, had acquired a different significance since Constable Weatherby's telephone call regarding the London train ticket. Dr. Bellingham entered the morning room with the measured deliberation that belonged to his profession, though his expression suggested consultation with thoughts that had acquired new gravity during the afternoon's reflection. "Inspector," he said, settling into the chair that Lady Beatrice had vacated, "I have been considering Julian's final moments with increased attention to details that my initial shock may have caused me to overlook." "Dr. Bellingham." "The expression of profound tranquility that I observe suggests something beyond mere cardiac failure. In my experience, certain botanical preparations can produce a sense of euphoria before the more serious effects manifest themselves." His voice carried the reluctant precision of someone applying professional knowledge to personal tragedy. The victim experiences what might be described as peaceful satisfaction, as if they had discovered exactly what they sought. Mrs. Prosser appeared with her customary discretion, bearing a small basin containing a fresh hellebore stem. "Mr. Peck provided this as you requested, Inspector. He mentioned that Mr. Ashworth had been most particular about the cutting yesterday evening." Alleyn examined the stem with systematic attention, noting the milky sap that appeared when the plant was disturbed. When he touched it briefly with his handkerchief, the familiar tingling sensation confirmed what the afternoon's investigation had suggested, that someone with numbed hands might easily misjudge the precision required for delicate manipulations. Dr. Bellingham, if someone had handled these stems extensively, what degree of sensation might they retain in their fingers? Sufficient numbness to affect fine motor control, certainly, though not enough to prevent gross manipulation. The doctor's clinical assessment carried implications that transcended botanical curiosity. Someone in such condition might spill liquids without registering the wetness, or misjudge the angle required for precise placement. The observation aligned itself with the metallic stains Fox had discovered at the table's edge, creating a pattern that spoke of careful preparation disrupted by physiological limitation. Someone had prepared Julian's final cup with meticulous attention, yet their compromised sense of touch had left traces that no amount of planning could entirely eliminate. Miranda Vale appeared at the threshold with the sort of hesitant grace that suggested she carried information requiring delicate delivery. "Inspector, I wondered if you might wish to know that Miss Fairfax has asked Mrs. Prosser to prepare a light supper in her room. She mentioned feeling unequal to company this evening." Most considerate of her to inform us, Miss Vale. There is something else, Inspector. During our first rehearsal, Miss Fairfax mentioned her years in India, her father's posting in Calcutta. She spoke of learning to prepare various botanical remedies from the local women, said it was knowledge that proved surprisingly useful in drawing rooms where conventional medicine might be inadequate. The revelation possessed the sort of quiet significance that transformed domestic conversation into forensic evidence. Colonial experience often included exposure to substances and techniques that English drawing rooms rarely encountered, knowledge that could serve purposes beyond mere household remedies. Fox returned as the evening deepened, his expression carrying the sort of satisfied efficiency that belonged to men who had gathered exactly the information they sought. Prentice and Gale confirm that Miss Fairfax has purchased bitter almond essence on 3 previous occasions, sir, always for theatrical purposes. And Harrington's mention that she was most specific about wanting almonds with noticeable fragrance, said she wanted the scent to carry to the back of the room. And Mr. Ashworth's railway arrangements. First-class compartment to London, sir, single journey purchased this afternoon. The station-master thought it worth mentioning that Mr. Ashworth seemed particularly concerned about departure times. The investigation had acquired the sort of elegant complexity that characterised cases where domestic routine had been transformed into something approaching art. Each piece of evidence, the chemical knowledge, the railway ticket, the specialised botanical expertise, contributed to a pattern that spoke of sophisticated planning rather than spontaneous passion. Lady Beatrice appeared in the doorway with the composed authority that had served her through decades of managing delicate social situations. Inspector, I have been reflecting upon yesterday evening's arrangements. Perhaps it would be beneficial to gather the company once more in the library. I believe we are all prepared to discuss the future of our theatrical endeavours with complete frankness. Lady Beatrice, I believe such a gathering would indeed prove illuminating, though I suspect the conversation may extend beyond mere theatrical considerations. Her glance met his with the sort of steady attention that belonged to women who understood when social performance must accommodate legal necessity. The evening had arranged itself with the sort of methodical precision that suggested truth was preparing to declare itself through the accumulated weight of evidence rather than dramatic revelation. The canvas turret stood visible through the French doors, maintaining its patient vigil with the sort of dignified persistence that belonged to stage properties awaiting their final scene. In the quiet accumulation of testimony, botanical, chemical, and psychological, Alleyn had begun to discern not merely the mechanics of murder, but the elegant choreography that had transformed Julian Rook's final performance into something that would require no curtain call. The library awaited with the sort of expectant dignity that belonged to rooms where truth had been invited to make itself comfortable among the carefully arranged furniture of civilized discourse. The library at Wintermere received the assembled company with the sort of patient dignity that belonged to rooms where truth had been invited to declare itself among leather bindings and polished mahogany. The February evening pressed against the tall windows with complete authority, transforming the space into a study in amber light and lengthening shadows where secrets could no longer maintain their careful disguises with quite the same conviction they had possessed 24 hours earlier. Lady Beatrice had arranged herself in the chair that commanded natural attention, her silver hair catching the lamplight with the composed elegance that her generation had perfected for navigating social catastrophes. The remaining members of Julian's theatrical company distributed themselves with unconscious choreography, Miranda Vale maintaining her luminous composure despite the strain visible in her careful stillness, Dr. Bellingham positioned near the fireplace with professional gravity, Mrs. Carstairs observing from her strategic vantage with colonial precision, Timothy Morivant polishing spectacles that required no attention, and Nigel Ashworth leaning against the bookshelf with studied nonchalance that failed to entirely conceal his underlying tension. Miss Fairfax had rejoined them, her earlier indisposition apparently yielded to necessity, though her composure possessed a brittleness that suggested careful maintenance rather than natural ease. She sat with hands folded in her lap, her expression arranged with a sort of practised serenity that belonged to those who had learned to navigate difficult social terrain through decades of careful observation and strategic silence. Alleyn entered with Fox at his shoulder, their combined presence transforming the library from drawing-room into something approaching courtroom, though the proceedings would maintain the courtesy that belonged to houses where justice wore white gloves and spoke in measured tones. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alleyn began, his voice carrying quiet authority that invited attention rather than demanding it. "Our understanding of yesterday evening's tragedy has progressed considerably. I believe we have reached the point where a complete reconstruction becomes both possible and necessary." He moved to the centre of the room with movements that retained their natural grace, despite the gravity of his purpose. Julian Rook died from hydrogen cyanide poisoning, administered through bitter almonds that had been treated with oil of bitter almond essence. The method required both sophisticated chemical knowledge and intimate familiarity with Julian's habits and preferences. The silence that followed possessed the weight of recognition. Dr. Bellingham's medical training had prepared him for such announcements, yet his expression suggested that professional knowledge provided little comfort when applied to personal circumstances. "The evidence forms an elegant pattern," Alleyn continued. "Miss Fairfax's specialised purchases from both Harrington's confectionery and Prentice & Gale chemist created the chemical foundation for this tragedy. Her request for bitter almonds with noticeable fragrance and her separate acquisition of oil of bitter almonds for theatrical purposes provided the necessary components." Miss Fairfax's hands tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap, though her expression maintained its careful neutrality. The disrupted tea service ritual provided opportunity. Mr. Ashworth's winter roses, hellebores, whose sap causes temporary numbness, required repositioning the tray and adjusting the normal flow of service. This created the precise moment when Julian's cup could be selected and treated without immediate observation. "If I may demonstrate," Alleyn said, moving toward the French doors. "Mrs. Prosser, would you be so kind as to arrange the tea service exactly as yesterday evening?" The procession to the music room possessed the solemnity of a judicial proceeding. Mrs. Prosser restored the tray to its position left of Julian's chair, the cups arranged in their clockwise geometry, the lemon dish positioned with mathematical precision. The canvas turret stood in patient attendance, its theatrical dignity unchanged by the morning's revelations. "Miss Vale, if you would resume your position as you did yesterday evening." Miranda moved with quiet grace to her accustomed place, her hands steady as she lifted the teapot. "Julian's cup would have been here," she said, indicating the position nearest the handle. I poured and passed it to him, then returned for my own. "And the lemon arrangement, Miss Fairfax?" Miss Fairfax approached with movements that retained their natural precision despite the circumstances. "I made a small adjustment for symmetry. The effect of poorly arranged service upon polished silver is regrettable." Yet as she demonstrated the motion, Alleyn noted the slight tremor in her hands that had been absent during her earlier confidence. Colonial experience often includes exposure to botanical preparations unknown in English drawing rooms, he observed gently. Knowledge that proves useful in various circumstances. India taught many lessons, Miss Fairfax replied, her voice maintaining its measured courtesy, though something had shifted in her tone. A quality that suggested walls carefully maintained for decades were beginning to acknowledge the pressure applied against them. They returned to the library in contemplative silence. The evidence had arranged itself with elegant precision, yet Alleyn understood that the human psychology underlying these arrangements required careful exposition rather than dramatic accusation. The note found in Miss Vale's script. He continued once they were seated. Purporting to be from Julian, bears handwriting that resembles his style yet carries the faint scent of bitter almonds. A theatrical device, perhaps, intended to suggest romantic intrigue while providing misdirection. Miranda's voice carried controlled emotion. Julian would never have arranged such a meeting so indirectly, Inspector. His courtesy was absolute. Precisely, Miss Vale. Which suggests the note served a different purpose entirely, establishing a narrative that might explain Julian's presence near the turret had anyone noticed him moving in that direction. Miss Fairfax's composure had acquired a quality of careful maintenance that suggested considerable effort. "Inspector," she said finally, her voice carrying the measured precision of someone who had reached a decision requiring courage. "You attribute considerable sophistication to what might have been mere coincidence." "I attribute nothing, Miss Fairfax, that the evidence does not clearly suggest. Your knowledge, your purchases, your precise timing, all contribute to a pattern that transcends coincidence. The library settled into attentive silence. Lady Beatrice's pearls caught the lamplight as she drew a careful breath, her expression maintaining its natural authority despite circumstances that challenged even her generation's training in social composure. 40 years of friendship, Miss Fairfax said quietly, her gaze moving to Lady Beatrice with something that might have been apology or explanation, creates certain obligations. Julian possessed charm that was universally acknowledged, but charm, Inspector, can inspire expectations that become quite burdensome when they remain unreciprocated. Her words carried the weight of confession delivered with the sort of dignified restraint that belonged to those who understood that truth, once spoken, could not be recalled. The evening had arranged itself with methodical precision, yet the human cost of such elegant arrangements would resonate long after the legal machinery completed its work. We shall continue this conversation tomorrow morning, Alleyn said with gentle authority. I believe we all require time to consider the full implications of what has been revealed. The company dispersed with relief they were careful to disguise as courtesy, leaving behind a silence that contained both resolution and the quiet recognition that some performances once concluded could never be repeated. The morning at Windermere arrived with that crystalline February clarity that made concealment impossible, though the house itself maintained its dignified composure with the sort of determined grace that belonged to establishments where tragedy had been required to observe proper etiquette. The frost held the lawns in tender suspension, transforming the grounds into something approaching a stage set where truth could no longer hide behind the comfortable arrangements of social performance. Alleyn found Miss Fairfax in the morning room, positioned near the window where pale sunlight transformed her silver hair into something approaching benediction, an irony that would not have escaped Julian Rook's appreciation for theatrical symbolism. She had dressed with exquisite care for what she understood would be her final performance at Windermere, her hands folded in her lap with the sort of composed stillness that could serve as armour against whatever accusations the morning might require her to face. Miss Fairfax, Alleyn began, settling into the chair opposite her with movements that conveyed respect rather than accusation. I believe we have arrived at the private portion of yesterday evening's performance. If you call it that, she replied evenly, her voice carrying the measured precision of someone who had spent the night arranging thoughts that could no longer be postponed, though the word suggests an intention to amuse rather than preserve. He allowed the silence its natural rights before continuing. Julian Rook died from hydrogen cyanide poisoning, administered through bitter almonds that had been treated with oil of bitter almonds. The method required both sophisticated chemical knowledge and intimate familiarity with his habits. Her hands, resting one upon the other, did not move. India is not altogether ornamental, Inspector. One learns certain things from women who cannot afford doctors and cannot risk the gossip of priests. Her voice carried the distant quality of someone consulting memories that had acquired new significance. My father's posting in Calcutta exposed me to various indigenous preparations. The local women possessed remarkable understanding of plant chemistry. You purchased the materials from both Harrington's and Prentice and Gale, the bitter almonds for their natural toxicity, enhanced with the concentrated essence. Julian was always so fond of almonds, said they reminded him of his mother's drawing room. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. I merely wished to elevate the experience for him. One does not need theatrics, Inspector. A single drop will suffice, if the brew is hot and the acid is present, and the subject convinced he is being served exactly what he loves. Lady Beatrice appeared in the doorway with movements that retained their natural authority, despite circumstances that challenged even her generation's training in social composure. Her pearls caught the morning light as she approached with the sort of measured dignity that suggested she had been listening to enough of the conversation to understand its implications. Cordelia, she said quietly, her voice carrying 40 years of shared history, I had no intention of displacing you. Julian's presence was never meant to diminish your importance to this household. Beatrice, your kindness has never been in question. Miss Fairfax's response carried the sort of gentle firmness that belonged to those who had reached conclusions that no amount of reassurance could modify. But there are loyalties that do not concern the law, and the law has no adequate names for them. I watched Julian arrive, all charm and artistic vision, half rescuer, half ruin. Her confession emerged with careful deliberation. Julian possessed that dangerous quality of making everyone feel specially chosen. When you announced your intention to establish him permanently here, to fund his new theatrical venture, I understood what would follow. He would have left you, my dear friend, with the bill and with a silence no one would have acknowledged. Fox entered with his characteristic discretion, bearing the Morning Post an official confirmation from London. The chemical analysis confirms hydrogen cyanide at lethal concentration, sir. Miss Fairfax received this confirmation with resigned acceptance. I prepared Julian's almonds with particular care, Inspector. The treated ones were positioned precisely where his habits would lead him to select them. He always chose from the left side of any arrangement, always took 3 pieces, and always consumed them while discussing artistic matters. The disrupted tea service ritual provided opportunity. The hellebore sap on Mr. Ashworth's hands created the necessary confusion. One must account for all variables, Inspector. Nigel's enthusiasm for cutting roses, his rather clumsy movements, these provided felicitous distraction. It allowed for the necessary adjustments without drawing attention. Her planning had possessed meticulous attention to detail that transformed domestic routine into elegant homicide. The forged note in Miss Vale's script. A precaution. Should anyone notice Julian's movements during the interval, the note would suggest he had arranged a private meeting. One must always have contingencies, even in the most carefully planned productions. Dr. Bellingham entered with professional gravity. The expression of tranquility I observed makes sense. Now, Cordelia. The prussic acid creates euphoria before unconsciousness. Julian experienced no distress. He died believing he'd found perfect artistic expression, Marcus. It seemed appropriate. Her voice carried something that might have been compassion, or merely professional satisfaction in work efficiently completed. The morning progressed with methodical precision, as Miss Fairfax provided details with the thoroughness of someone who understood that complete cooperation might influence justice's eventual application. Yet underneath the civilized discourse lay recognition that her actions had transformed charitable entertainment into Greek tragedy. Inspector, Lady Beatrice said finally, what arrangements must be made? Miss Fairfax will accompany Constable Weatherby to Harting for formal charges. The circumstances will be presented with appropriate consideration for her cooperation. Miss Fairfax rose with movements that retained their natural grace. Beatrice, you will find the household accounts in perfect order. Mrs. Prosser possesses complete knowledge of all arrangements. Cordelia. My dear friend, some performances conclude with applause, others with silence. Julian would have appreciated the artistic symmetry of this particular denouement. She departed with Constable Weatherby with composed dignity, as if attending a social engagement rather than surrendering to legal custody. Lady Beatrice remained at the window, her expression carrying the sort of grief that belonged to those who had learned to accommodate loss without abandoning dignity. The morning had arranged itself with elegant precision, yet the human cost of such sophisticated planning would resonate through Windermere's corridors long after the investigation's machinery completed its work. In the silence that settled over the morning room, the only certainty was that Julian Rook's final performance had achieved the sort of artistic completion that no amount of rehearsal could have provided, though the price of such perfection had proved considerably higher than anyone had anticipated when the evening's entertainment began. The canvas turret stood visible through the French doors, maintaining its patient vigil with dignified persistence, waiting for revelations that would transform it from mere theatrical property into monument, a silent witness to the sort of performance that required no audience save justice itself. The morning at Windermere possessed that crystalline quality which belongs to houses where tragedy has concluded its performance, and ordinary life must somehow resume its interrupted rhythms, though the very air seemed to retain the weight of confessions that could never be recalled. Miss Fairfax had departed with Constable Weatherby, with the sort of composed dignity that suggested she was attending a social engagement, rather than surrendering to legal custody, her silver hair catching the pale February, light as she entered the waiting motor car with movements that retained their natural grace, despite circumstances that would have shattered lesser composures. Lady Beatrice remained at the morning-room window long after the motor car had disappeared beyond the winter trees, her posture maintaining the sort of steady authority that her generation had perfected for absorbing shocks without visible fracture. When she finally turned from her vigil, her expression carried the controlled calm that belonged to those who understood that some performances, once concluded, required immediate attention to their practical consequences. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying the measured courtesy that her position demanded, "Nigel has requested a word with you. I believe he possesses information that may complete your understanding of yesterday evening's arrangements." Nigel Ashworth entered with movements that had lost their customary languid confidence, his usual air of studied nonchalance replaced by something approaching genuine distress. He carried himself like a man who had discovered that his casual participation in domestic errands had acquired significance far beyond his understanding or intention. "Inspector," he began, his voice carrying a maturity that the morning's events had apparently required him to discover, "I must tell you about the chemical purchases. Miss Fairfax did not make them herself. She sent me to Harting as her agent, though I was too obtuse to recognise the true nature of my commission." He settled into the chair with movements that suggested consultation with memories that had acquired uncomfortable clarity. She mentioned, with that particular delicacy that older ladies employ when they wish not to be refused, that Harrington's had disappointed her before. If I were calling in Harting, as indeed I planned to do for my solicitor's appointment, a small bottle of essence would prove useful for enhancing the theatrical atmosphere. Her exact words, "Inspector." I am not accustomed to reading murder into errands for elderly ladies. The lemon essence as well. I added that myself from a sense of propriety. It seemed unseemly to purchase only bitter almonds. I thought I was providing respectability to what appeared an innocent domestic request. His voice carried the sort of bitter self-recrimination that belonged to those who discovered themselves unwitting accomplices to sophisticated planning. Fox approached with his characteristic discretion, bearing an envelope that possessed the sort of official precision which transformed personal correspondence into legal evidence. "From Miss Fairfax, sir, left with Mr. Chard before her departure." The letter, when Alleyn examined it, bore Miss Fairfax's elegant hand and contained not confession in any legal sense, but the sort of moral inventory that her generation believed one owed to friendship. Her words carried the measured precision of someone setting accounts in order before departing on a journey from which return was neither expected nor desired. "I must correct a fault of omission," she had written. "When Julian arrived at Windermere, I recognised him as one recognises influenza. Charming, inevitable, destructive. You who love me would never have believed the destruction when it came. You would have excused, you would have paid, you would have smiled. I have prevented that. It is not for the law to determine whether my prevention was moral, only whether it was murder. I accept their vocabulary, though it possesses fewer words and considerably less precision than the circumstances warrant." Her final paragraph returned with characteristic practicality to household matters. Mrs. Prosser would find in the blue tin all receipts and a comprehensive list of subscriptions due. "It is insufferable," she concluded, "to leave administrative muddles for others to resolve." Lady Beatrice received the letter with the sort of quiet attention that belonged to those who understood that friendship could accommodate complexities, extending far beyond conventional boundaries. "She has done what she always did, Inspector, made arrangements that would spare me difficulty, though I confess the method exceeded even her usual thoroughness." Dr. Bellingham entered with professional gravity, bearing the documents that modern death required before it could be permitted to rest in peace. "The formalities are complete, Inspector, though I find myself reflecting upon a conversation I had with Cordelia some months ago. She asked whether euphoria before death constituted kindness or deception. I answered like a physician, and failed to answer her at all." She understood the distinction better than most, Doctor. Her method ensured Julian experienced no distress, merely the peaceful satisfaction of someone who believed he had found exactly what he sought. The afternoon progressed with methodical attention to the practical arrangements that Miss Fairfax's departure necessitated. Mrs. Prosser assumed additional responsibilities, with the sort of steady competence that suggested she had been preparing for such eventualities. though her movements carried a new gravity that acknowledged the permanent alteration of Wintermere's domestic arrangements. Miranda Vale appeared with her luminous composure intact, though her eyes held the sort of thoughtful sadness that belonged to those who had witnessed the transformation of charitable entertainment into genuine tragedy. "I shall return to London tomorrow, Lady Beatrice. My aunt in Chelsea would welcome my company, and I find myself requiring distance from theatrical endeavours for the present." "Of course, my dear, though I hope you will remember that Julian's enthusiasm for your performances was both genuine and deserved. His final curtain call should not diminish the pleasure he found in your artistic development." The canvas turret stood visible through the French doors, maintaining its patient vigil with the sort of dignified persistence that belonged to theatrical properties that had witnessed performances extending far beyond their original purpose. Mrs. Prosser had placed a single winter rose upon the music stand, not tribute nor reproach, but simple acknowledgement that some stages, once used for certain performances, acquired memorial significance that transcended their theatrical function. As evening approached, Alleyn found himself considering the elegant complexity of Miss Fairfax's final performance. Her method had possessed the sort of sophisticated planning that transformed domestic routine into art, yet the human psychology underlying such arrangements spoke to loyalties that extended beyond conventional understanding. In drawing-rooms where devotion wore evening dress and spoke in measured tones, the most profound acts of protection could require accommodating moral territories that legal vocabulary could never adequately map. "Fox," he said quietly, "we shall depart tomorrow morning. The investigation is complete, though I suspect its implications will resonate through Wintermere's corridors long after we have returned to London." The household settled into its evening routines with the sort of determined grace that belonged to establishments where tragedy had been required to observe proper etiquette. Yet in the careful restoration of familiar rhythms lay acknowledgement that some performances, once concluded, left permanent alterations in their wake, changes that no amount of domestic efficiency could entirely accommodate, though they might be managed with the sort of dignified competence that Miss Fairfax had taught them all to value above more dramatic expressions of grief. The winter roses continued their patient decline in their crystal vase, their botanical testimony now understood and properly catalogued. The bitter almonds had been removed from evidence, though their memory would linger in the careful attention that future tea services would require. And in the silence that had settled over the music room like dust over abandoned furniture, the only certainty was that Julian Rook's final curtain call had achieved the sort of artistic completion that would have earned his professional admiration had he lived to appreciate the elegant precision of its execution. The morning of departure arrived at Wintermere with that crystalline February clarity that made concealment impossible, though the house itself maintained its dignified composure with the sort of determined grace that belonged to establishments where tragedy had been required to observe proper etiquette. The inquest at Harting had concluded with appropriate brevity. Wilful murder, the coroner had pronounced with judicial restraint, though the words carried weight that would resonate through drawing-rooms long after legal proceedings reached their formal conclusion. Alleyn found Lady Beatrice in the morning-room, arranging correspondence with movements that suggested life's essential machinery must continue regardless of personal catastrophe. Her pearls caught the pale light as she looked up with the composed authority that her generation had perfected for absorbing shocks without visible fracture. "Inspector," she said, her voice carrying measured courtesy despite circumstances that challenged even her considerable reserves. "Miranda has departed for London. Her aunt in Chelsea will provide the distance she requires from theatrical endeavours. Nigel accompanies her to the station as penance more likely to improve him than mere remorse. Dr. Bellingham returns to his practice with additional understanding of how botanical knowledge can serve purposes beyond healing. And Miss Fairfax, Lady Beatrice? Cordelia will face her trial with the same dignity she brought to 40 years of friendship. Her solicitor speaks of mitigation, age, cooperation, the absence of previous transgression. Whether mercy follows remains to be determined by those who must weigh protection against murder." Her pause suggested consultation with loyalties that transcended legal categories. "She is written to express regret for the disruption to household arrangements. Even in custody, Cordelia cannot bear administrative muddles." Mrs. Prosser appeared with their luggage, her movements carrying the efficient precision of someone whose professional competence had been tested by extraordinary circumstances and found adequate. "The music room has been restored, Inspector. The turret will go to a parish hall in the next county. They're mounting a medieval pageant and appreciate donated properties." "Most practical, Mrs. Prosser." "Waste is insufferable, sir, though I confess the room feels different now. Not haunted precisely, but altered. Some stages, once used for certain performances, acquire significance that transcends their original purpose." The motor car waited with patient dignity as Alleyn and Fox settled into seats that would carry them away from domestic tragedy toward London's more familiar criminalities. The gravel beneath the wheels made its customary sound, like distant applause for actors who had acquitted themselves with varying degrees of success in a performance none had expected to give. "A curious case, Fox," Alleyn observed as Wintermere's elegant facade receded into winter landscape. Miss Fairfax committed murder with the sort of sophisticated planning that transformed domestic routine into art, yet her motivation remained protection of someone she loved from disappointment she could not bear to witness. "The bitter almonds were her masterstroke, sir," Fox replied with professional appreciation for criminal artistry that transcended personal approval. Julian's documented fondness provided both opportunity and camouflage. The oil of bitter almonds enhanced their natural toxicity while maintaining familiar taste that would prevent suspicion. Indeed, and the hellebore sap created precisely the sort of domestic confusion necessary for her purposes. Nigel's numbed hands ensured he would handle the tea service with less precision than usual, providing the perfect moment for her adjustments. Alleyn's voice carried recognition of the elegant choreography that had transformed charitable entertainment into Greek tragedy. She possessed that dangerous combination of sophisticated intelligence and absolute devotion. When such qualities encounter perceived threats, the results can achieve remarkable precision. The train journey to London proceeded with methodical inevitability, though Alleyn understood that the human elements of the case would require considerably more time to reach proper resolution. Miss Fairfax would answer for her actions with the sort of quiet dignity that her generation had perfected for navigating difficult circumstances, yet the moral complexities of her crime extended far beyond legal vocabulary. The irony, Fox, is that, in attempting to preserve, she ultimately fractured the very world she sought to protect. Wintermere will never be quite the same. The understanding between Lady Beatrice and Miss Fairfax, forged over 40 years, has been irrevocably altered, even if loyalty chooses to accommodate forgiveness. Justice will be served, sir, though perhaps not in the dramatic fashion that Julian might have staged for his audiences. Justice, yes, though I suspect the deeper questions will outlive legal proceedings. In drawing rooms where devotion wears evening dress and speaks in measured tones, the most profound acts of protection can require accommodating moral territories that conventional understanding cannot adequately map. As London's suburbs announced their approach with increasing frequency, Alleyn found himself reflecting upon the theatrical metaphor that had governed the entire investigation. Miss Fairfax had directed her final production with meticulous attention to detail that would have earned Julian's professional admiration had he lived to appreciate its elegant execution. The canvas turret would continue its patient vigil over an empty stage, waiting for performances that would never again achieve such chilling completion. Some cases conclude with satisfaction, Fox, others with recognition that human nature contains complexities extending far beyond legal categories. Miss Fairfax transformed tea service into elegant homicide while believing herself engaged in an act of profound loyalty. The train entered Victoria Station with mechanical authority, delivering them to a London where justice would proceed with institutional efficiency, while the moral ambiguities of the case continued their more complex resolution. In the careful arrangements of evidence and the elegant precision of confession, Alleyn had encountered criminal artistry that challenged conventional understanding while demanding professional respect for its sophisticated execution. The Wintermere case would remain in his memory not for dramatic revelations, but for its quiet demonstration that the most profound human actions often occurred in domestic settings where politeness masked passions capable of accommodating murder with the same grace they brought to serving tea. In drawing rooms where secrets wore evening dress and loyalty could transform protection into elegant violence, the human heart remained terrain of infinite and often perilous subtlety. a landscape that no amount of detection could entirely map, though justice might occasionally find its way through the careful geography of motive, method, and the sort of devotion that recognised no boundaries save those it chose to observe.